All right, welcome to the conclusion of the rise of the totalitarian dictators in between World War I and World War II. We're going to finish up with Adolf Hitler and the rise of Nazi Germany. So where does the term Nazi come from? Well, ultimately, it's a combination of both nationalism, or I should say extreme nationalism, and also racism. And we will talk about the roots of their racist beliefs. And therefore, we come up with the term Nazism. And so the fact that they were so nationalistic, so proud of their German heritage, it really fed their desire to want to try and conquer other nations because they wanted to build their empire as large as possible. And also, what's going to feed them more than anything else is their extreme hatred for the Weimar Republic, especially the fact that they signed the Treaty of Versailles and ultimately considered it to be. So the racist ideas are going to stem from Hitler's concepts in his book that he wrote while in prison, Mein Kampf. The idea that the Aryan race, or those who were considered to have blue eyes and blonde hair, the Germanic peoples, were racially superior to anyone else. And those inferior are going to be the Jews and the Slavs. In fact, they saw them so inferior that they deserved to be exterminated. Hitler believed that Slavs should be considered as slaves to the Aryan race, and that's why he carried out all the atrocities he did on these groups of people. We already know a little bit about how Hitler came to power. This is kind of repetitive of some of the things that we talked about. We know that once he left World War I, he was looking for a job and was asked to spy on the German Workers' Party, and eventually became the leader of it and renamed it the Nazi Party in 1919. At first, it started out just as a tiny group of only about 7 people, but when Hitler was able to come to power in charge of this group, it started to grow dramatically within just a few short years. And so they started calling themselves the Brown Shirts. That's because they wore brown shirts. And one of the things that they were known for was terrorizing political opponents on the streets. So kind of like bullies walking around the streets of Germany, especially putting down anyone that would be supportive of the Weimar Republic. In effect, it was kind of like Hitler's own private army before he was able to build his own army. And they were very loyal to Hitler. He was considered to be their leader. And you can see them there in their brown shirts carrying the swastika, which was their symbol. Here is another picture that shows you Hitler before he came to power in Germany at a Nuremberg rally in 1927. So again, review, we talked about the beer hall push when he was trying to overthrow Bavaria and ultimately all of Germany after that, but unfortunately was caught, sentenced to 9 months in jail. But even though this was, not the best outcome that Hitler wanted, it was good in the sense that it now gave him national attention, and he realized that in the future he was going to have to take over legally, not through a violent revolution, and that's exactly what he goes on to do. After the fail of the beer hall push and was arrested, he actually ran away and was later caught, and remember his partners were shot at and so forth. Okay, so while in jail, we know that he wrote about Mein Kampf, and one of the things that he talks about, make sure you highlight this as an important vocab word, is that Germans needed Lebensraum. Lebensraum is translated as living space, and they wanted to expand their territory back to the glory days of Germany and beyond, and remove any Jews that would be living in this living space and make the slaves slave labor. He was the one who blamed the Jews for the problems that Germany was dealing with, and a lot of people bought into this idea as well. And so eventually he figured that the Führer, or the ruler of Germany, would have unlimited arbitrary power. Arbitrary, ultimately, when translated, means random, but in Hitler's case, not very random at all. But unlimited power, and that's eventually what he was. And so here's a picture of Mein Kampf, the book that he wrote. Okay, so the Weimar Republic, and hopefully this is something you were able to understand when you write your DBQ, it's really a result of the Great Depression. the Great Depression happened all throughout the entire world, not just the United States. Unemployment reached 43% in Germany by the end of 1932. And so this is exactly what Hitler wants. This is going to play directly into his hands because he's going to start promising the German voters salvation from this corrupt government and be able to help them come out of this economic depression. So ultimately, it worked because people were looking for a hero, and Hitler was the one promising them he could do that. He promised big business leaders that he would be able to restore the economy by breaking Germany's strong labor movement and also reducing workers' wages if necessary. So on the one hand, that's how he appealed to the business leaders. And also, he's going to appeal to the army. Remember, he was a World War I veteran himself, basically saying that he's going to completely reject the Versailles Treaty and rearm Germany, which is exactly what he did. And by making these promises, people were able to put their trust and faith in him. Another thing that he appealed to was the German youth. They were hoping that these young, motivated individuals would be able to support their movement. And so the statistics really help you see that 40% of the Nazi Party was under the age of 30, and 67% were under the age of 40. So the large majority of those belonging to the Nazi Party was a younger generation in Germany looking for a future and a hope. Hitler could bring that. So in 1930, the Weimar Chancellor was able to gain permission from the president at the time. His name was Hindenburg, and Hindenburg was one of the generals that led the armies in World War I, for emergency rule by decree. And so we start to see this struggle between the Social Democrats and also the Communists, and that's ultimately what's going to lead to the breakdown of the Weimar government. They really couldn't come to an agreement. We talked about this in our previous PowerPoint, the challenges that the Weimar government was constantly going through because of the weaknesses that it had to deal with. So eventually the Nazis were able to win the largest percentage of votes in the Reichstag. It wasn't the majority, but they did gain a large portion of it. And so as a result of so many votes, they demanded that Hitler have a leadership role in government. So he didn't win the most important position as chancellor, which he wanted, but they still wanted to give him an important position, and he was able to get that. And so here's one of the propaganda posters. As you can see, it's supposed to indicate that they're in chains. Notice he's wearing a Nazi belt. And they're like, enough, vote for Hitler. And so propaganda was in full swing. Here's another one. It says work and food. It was used in the election because they actually considered this to be one of their most effective posters, promising people exactly what they were missing from the current government situation. Eventually, Hitler was able to become chancellor on January 30th, 1933, because the president, Paul von Hindenburg, appointed him to that important position. So he got what he wanted, the Nazi Party got what they wanted, and so now he's basically second in command underneath the president, who was Hindenburg. Now, it's important to keep in mind that Hindenburg was about 93 years old at this particular time. Here's another poster. You can see the two men standing next to each other. It says, in the deepest need, Hindenburg chose Adolf Hitler for Reich Chancellor. You too should vote for List 1. So again, propaganda putting him in power. So eventually, Hitler was able to gain his power. Hindenburg was too old. He wasn't really able to rule the way he wanted. And so Hitler was able to consolidate his power, and he was able to create something that he's going to be calling the Third Reich. And so Reich means empire. So this is the Third German Empire. So just as a recap, see if you can remember the first two. The first one would be the Holy Roman Empire. Remember, all the way back under Charles V. And then the second Reich would be under Wilhelm I and Otto von Bismarck when Germany was united. The Third Reich is under Hitler. So there was a fire in the Reichstag that happened in 1933, which actually was set by So the brown shirts stepped in and, they stepped up its terrorism of political opponents. So anyone that was considered to be an opponent of the Nazi Party, the brown shirts were now going to use violence against them, as was a perfect example with the Reichstag fire. So by March 1933, the Reichstag passed something called the Enabling Act. And in doing so, Hitler was able to gain absolute power for just 4 years. And the Nazi Party was the only party that was legal in the German government at this time. And so we can start to see where Hitler is going to take his absolute power and start to abuse it and use it to really crack down on anyone that could be a potential enemy. So he outlawed strikes, he abolished independent labor movements, publishers, universities, writers were brought into line. In other words, that's where that propaganda and indoctrination comes into play that we talked about the other day. And any literature that was anti-Nazi, including democratic, socialist, and Jewish literature, were put on blacklists, which means that they were not allowed to be published. So here's the censorship. Anyone who possessed one of these forbidden books, they would burn them in public squares, and any type of modern art was completely prohibited. There's actually some really interesting films that highlight how the Germans respected and stole a lot of classic art, Renaissance art, and so forth, but modern art was prohibited because they actually saw it as degenerate and possibly even anti-German. And so they decided to stage a massive exhibition of degenerative art in Munich in 1937 to kind of basically tell people that this is degenerative art and you shouldn't be looking at it. But ironically, it wound up bringing more visitors than the exhibit of approved art. And so this is a poster that's announcing its exhibition. So that plan kind of backfired. So just an interesting side point. And so here's a picture of the Hitler Youth, probably some professors and students burning books and hailing Hitler. And art, honestly, was considered to be one of the most important elements of strengthening the Third Reich and purifying the nation. So their political aims and artistic expressions actually unified and became one. But the art that was important is art that you see here, not the modern art that people were starting to use, but art used to promote propaganda. And they used it to shape the attitudes and the stereotypes that were coming from this particular time period. And so here, Hitler gives a salute to those who had died, defending him. And as you can see, there's some interesting classical pieces attached to this particular form of art. No form of modern art here in any way. So Joseph Goebbels was Hitler's right-hand man, and he appointed him as the Minister of Propaganda, and he's going to use whatever means necessary to try to glorify Hitler and also the Nazi state. For example, one particular documentary that was directed by Leni Riefenstahl was called The Triumph of the Will, and it was used by Hitler's regime to make Hitler look more powerful than he actually was and to glorify the Nazi regime. Very similar to what we talked about with Eisenstein and Stalin. So you can see that they had these important individuals by their side to help promote their popularity as much as possible to the German people. And then in 1934, in June of 1934, you guys might remember this from the video that we watched in class, but it was known as the Night of the Long Knives because Hitler was given information that army and big business were very suspicious of the brown shirts. And so he decided that it would be best to go around and kill anyone who was considered to be a traitor. And so his personal guard, known as the SS, they either arrested or shot without a trial 1,000 leaders and other political enemies that could have been potentially a threat. So this is very similar to the Great Purge of Stalin. Obviously, Stalin killed a lot more, but you can see this is something that they both had in common. And this personal army of his, known as the SS, really started to grow in influence. And it was his private army, his secret police, and as you can see from the picture here, this is the leader of the SS, Heinrich Himmler. You might be familiar with him because he's mentioned a lot in history books and also films like Schindler's List and so forth. So they joined together with Hitler's political police known as the Gestapo, and they started to expand their network, and also they were the creators of the concentration camps. And Hitler was able to recruit for these groups by what is known as the Hitler Youth, where Nazis would use any means necessary to basically brainwash them into the German views of racial superiority and the inferiority of Jews, and that they were the source of Germany's problems. And so by having them get on board with this particular way of thinking, it was easy for them to follow orders and also do what they did to those in the concentration camps. So basically, membership of the Hitler Youth is going to become mandatory of all young people in Germany, those who were not part of the groups that Hitler disagreed with, of course. And so this is a really good example of what we were talking about before, in contrast to the 17th century absolute rulers. They were basically just seeking obedience, but the Hitler Youth was mandatory participation in order to support Hitler's power. And so included in this, children were encouraged to turn anyone in. That included their teachers, their parents, their siblings, if they seemed to be disloyal to the Third Reich. Here is a picture of the propaganda of the Hitler Youth. It says, "Youth serves the Fuhrer, all 10-year-olds into the Hitler Youth," and it was mandatory by 1936. A picture of a rally where Hitler was addressing these young ones, and you can see them there in the Nazi uniform as well, kind of showing a sign of unity. So as you know, Nazism is a combination of both nationalism and also racism, and so we're going to talk a little bit about how he treated the Jews at this time. By the end of 1934, anyone who was Jewish, including those in very important positions like lawyers, doctors, professors, and so forth, they had completely lost their jobs. They were not allowed to practice their professions anymore, and this is basically because of the Nuremberg laws, which deprived them even of their citizenship. And so this is very similar to the Jim Crow laws of the South in the United States, in the sense basically that any type of marriage or sex between a Jew and a non-Jew was completely forbidden and prohibited, among other things as well. For example, they were not allowed, Jews, if they did still practice their business, they were not allowed to hire German women under the age of 45 as maybe a chef or a maid or something like that. And they were also forbidden from displaying the Reich or national flag. So even if they did want to support Germany, they couldn't. Other laws included in the Nuremberg laws included the fact that Jews couldn't use hospitals. They couldn't be educated past the age of 14. They were not allowed to use public parks, libraries, beaches, and any war memorials. For example, those who sacrificed themselves in World War I were to have all of the Jewish names removed. So really trying to eliminate any trace of Jewish residency or population as possible. And so as a result, by 1939, 50% of the Jews had emigrated, basically moving to other countries if possible. Many of them had moved to France. Some had tried to even go overseas. Most of them were considered to have those really important jobs or the cream of the crop. And so in order to try to stop this from happening, Germany would invoke these huge fees and also confiscate their property. A very famous night, definitely that you need to know, you'll probably see this again, was that of Kristallnacht. It's known as the Night of Broken Glass, and it took place in 1938, where Hitler had ordered an attack on all Jewish communities. And so basically there was this assassination of a German diplomat in Paris by a Jewish boy, and they thought that in retaliation to this happening, they would be able to stage this attack. And it was very well organized, where It was this huge wave of violence that destroyed Jewish homes, Jewish synagogues, Jewish businesses by destroying the windows in their businesses and homes. That's why it's called broken glass. And thousands of Jews were arrested, and also they were forced to pay for the damage that the Nazis had made in the Night of Broken Glass. Very terrible time in history. Here are some pictures showing you what it looked like. Many of them were destroyed, windows broken in. Very difficult to bounce back from something like this. And here's one of the synagogues that was burned during Kristallnacht. This was a poster in 1940 that was used really to kind of advertise the worst of the Nazi and anti-Semitic films. It's called The Eternal Jew. Here they're accused, you can kind of see the large nose that they would often associate Jews with. And it says, the Jew, the inciter of war, the prolonger of war. So even propaganda against the Jews. Hitler said in his own words, this is quoted in a book by Joachim Fest in 1974. His book on Hitler, he has a direct quote that says, "Nature is cruel, therefore we are also entitled to be cruel. When I send the flower of German youth into the steel hail of the next war without feeling the slightest regret over the precious German blood that is being spilled, should I not also have the same right to eliminate millions of an inferior race that multiplies like vermin?" So this pretty much sums up how Hitler felt. And so eventually this culminates or peaks in what you are very familiar with is known as the Holocaust, where 6 million European Jews were killed in World War II. The Holocaust is also entitled Hitler's Final Solution, where he created a systematic way of destroying the Jewish population. But please keep in mind that Jews were not the only ones who were affected by this. Many other groups were as well, and we'll discuss that a little bit more when we talk about our World War II PowerPoint. Some of the victims, as I mentioned, and were included in this were Slavs, which they considered to be slave, Gypsies, which if you don't know what a gypsy is, they are people who are of the Romanian background or Roma culture, and they're often known for being kind of manipulative and taking advantage of people. They kind of have this bad reputation of being nomads, but they got the name gypsy from the fact that they looked Egyptian, and that's where people gave them the nickname gypsy. Another group that was persecuted were Jehovah's Witnesses, and you might be familiar with Jehovah's Witnesses today. They're the group that's recognized as going around and trying to teach people the Bible. And so the reason they were persecuted is because they refused to fight in war, which is true even today, and they also refused to Heil Hitler. And it's interesting about Jehovah's Witnesses is they were the only group So how is Germany going to recover economically from the mishaps of the Weimar Republic and the Great Depression? Well, this is one of the reasons why Hitler was able to become so popular is because of the things that he promised. For example, he promised work and bread, very similar to the same things that Lenin had promised the Russian people as well. So one of the things that he started was a large public works program, trying to get Germany out of the Depression, very similar to the New Deal of Roosevelt in the United States, trying to build superhighways. Many of you might be familiar with the Autobahn that runs through Germany, creating new offices and sports stadiums, public housing, really putting people back to work and trying to rebuild the economy of Germany. And so you can see from this chart how quickly and how efficiently the German economy was able to recover. We see a spike there in 1932 when things really started to improve, as with most of the world as they came out of the Great Depression. So here's a picture of the Autobahn that was created. So the Nazis are responsible for that. And the point of them building it really was to try to transport military vehicles, but you can see all the people that it employed in the construction of this particular road. Very important part of the economic recovery of Germany. Here's a propaganda poster where it says, "Hitler is building, help him buy German goods." So really showing the benefits of his economic program, with, of course, the Nazi flag flying in the background. And another one that says, "The Winter Aid was the Nazi Party charity. Each year there was a drive to solicit donations to try to help the needy, but it wasn't necessarily voluntary. As you can see, people are kind of encouraged to do so. It says, 'No one shall go hungry, no one shall be cold.'" So you can see them trying to get as much donations as possible to help as many people as possible. So a noble effort, but probably not the best way to go about it. And this is the one that says, "Germany is free." Ultimately, they felt trapped underneath the Weimar Republic, but they looked to Hitler to free them from this corruption. So another interesting part during Hitler's reign in 1936, Germany was the host of the Olympics in Berlin. And really, he thought that this was a great way to signal Germany's legitimacy by the International Committee, to recognize Germany as an important power, especially after their reputation after World War I. What's interesting, too, is that Hitler thought he would be able to use this as an opportunity to show off his Aryan race, because he would use Aryan athletes in the Olympics. But if any of you know anything about Olympic history, this was the year that Jesse Owens won the gold in track and field. And in case you don't know who he is in fact an African American. And so completely disproving Hitler's Aryan philosophy. Another thing in 1936 is when Germany started to spend their government funding on the military. So as a result of these policies in trying to rebuild the German economy, unemployment actually dropped from 6 million in 1933 to only about 1 million in 1936. So that's a good thing. And then in 1938, they started to have a shortage of workers because many people were enlisting in the military. So women started taking the jobs that were earlier denied by the Nazis because they were anti-feminist, but they recognized that somebody needed to fill these positions. And so eventually the standard of living started to moderately increase, and businesses were profiting pretty sharply. So we can start to see that Hitler made do on his promises, and people were putting more trust in him. So was there really a social revolution underneath the Nazi Party? Well, most of the well-educated classes held on to most advantages they possessed prior to the rise of Hitler. So not really much changed in that sense. Only a modest social leveling occurred. So not really a huge difference in terms of social classes changing or anything like that. Women were still considered to be housewives and mothers. Their social status didn't change that much. Instead, he actually implored or encouraged German women that it was their job and their civic and national duty to make babies for the Reich, and that's ultimately what they were encouraged to do. So birth control was absolutely forbidden for German women. They were encouraged to continue to build up the Third Reich. Of course, birth control was allowed for Jews, Gypsies, and Slavs because, of course, they didn't want them to reproduce. But women were denied some of the important jobs outside of the home, so that we can see that there really isn't that much of a social change in terms of how women were viewed. It was only during World War II where large numbers of women were then used for offices and factories because so many men were used in fighting the war. So this pretty much wraps up some of the changes that took place in Germany between World War I and World War II, and how Hitler came to power, and also his views on the different races and so forth. And our next PowerPoint, we're going to discuss really the start of World War II.